to chapter 2. We are working off an outline. And on our outline for 2 Peter, Roman numeral 3, section B, prophetic proof of God's judgment. And we might even get into condemnation on the wrongness of their doctrine. The author of 2 Peter in this section begins by reviewing a bit of Old Testament history, some stories, to prove that the fate of these false teachers in the Christian community, what's in store for them? It's the same as the unrighteous in these stories that he will use. The other thing we need to keep in mind is that much of this seems to have been borrowed from that little letter that this group has already studied, the little letter to Jude in the New Testament. So starting from chapter 2, verse 4, we're just going to go 4 through 10. Using the New American Bible translation, although we will also look at other translations. So, if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but condemned them to the chains of Tartarus, handed them over to be kept for judgment, and if he did not spare the ancient world, even though he preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, together with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the godless world, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction, reducing them to ashes, making them an example for the godless people of what is coming, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man, oppressed by the licentious conduct of unprincipled people, for day after day, that righteous man living among them was tormented in his righteous soul at the lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the devout from trial and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. We're going to stop right there. For the day of judgment. Well, and especially those who follow the flesh with its deprived desire and show contempt for lordship. So, pretty long sentence, someone says. Yes, if we take a close look. Verse 4 starts with if. Verse 9 in this translation starts with then. If this, then that. The entire paragraph is indeed in the form of one long conditional sentence, filled with all the conditional clauses. It's amazing. But it ends with speaking of the day of judgment. That actually sets the tone for the whole discourse. Remember, we said earlier, the false teachers that are being condemned in this letter, one of their accusations is that the day of the Lord, the second coming, the final judgment, hasn't happened. The apostles have died out, some of the disciples have died out, and Christ didn't come again. So they're saying, guess what? He's probably not going to come again. So we're free. We're free. We're free to do what we want. We're free of moral constraints. So this section is setting out as proof. Proof of what? Proof that they're wrong. Huh? Proof that they're wrong. Now, I said that he uses examples that are quite similar to what we saw in the letter of Jude, verses 5 through 7. I just want to put this up, the comparison. So, the letter of Jude, 2 Peter. For some reason, I like to think in colors. It helps me remember more. I don't know why. I think I dream in colors too. So, and Peter 4 through 10a. Now, if you take a closer look, just to remind you, in Jude, he uses three examples. Okay. The desert generation, basically from Exodus. Okay. The second one is he has a reference to fallen angels. And the third is he uses Sodom and Gomorrah. In this one, 2 Peter, he shifts it a little bit, but there are some similarities. He outlines, first of all, the fate of fallen angels. And then here's a shift. He uses Noah, and evidently Noah's family. And third, he uses the example of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, in both authors, in both instances, they're using these examples as proof of ultimately God's judgment will come upon those who are sinful. Ultimately, God's judgment comes upon the unrighteous. Let's take a look at here in verse 4. 2 Peter's use of the so-called fallen angels. Or if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but condemned them to the chains of Tartarus, and handed them over to be kept for judgment. We'll stop right there. Now, the biblical roots for the fallen angel story. The biblical roots are actually in Genesis chapter 6. May or may not be familiar with that. Genesis chapter 6. In this translation it reads, "When men began to multiply on earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of heaven saw how beautiful the daughters of men were, and so they took for their wives as many of them as they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not remain in man forever, since he is my flesh. His days shall comprise 120 years. At that time the Nephilim appeared on earth, after, as well as later, after the sons of heaven and had intercourse with the daughters of men who bore them sons. They were the heroes of old and men of renown." Now, both Jude and 2 Peter speak of these so-called sons of heaven. I use the term fallen angels. Do any of you in your translation have fallen angels in that passage from Genesis? No one?
Yeah.
Where? Okay. At the end of the Genesis story, it talked about the Nephilim, right? These were the Nephilim. Well, the word Nephilim in Hebrew is fallen angels. Okay? Years ago, when I was teaching in high school, Catholic high school, we had a translation, and for that passage in which we read sons of heaven, or your passage might have sons of God, these fallen angels. It had aliens. So I used to tell the high school students, okay, you believe the Bible, it's in the Bible about space aliens coming down. No, you're kidding. Yeah, right there. And then we pulled out that translation of the Bible that referred to these sons of gods or fallen angels. Now, there's a whole background story to this. And basically, this story in Genesis is kind of a proof for an existence, evidently, of a race or a group of very, very tall ancient peoples. In other passages from the Pentateuch, it will identify the Nephilim along with the Anakim. In Numbers, look at Numbers, chapter 13, verse 33 and 34. A scouting mission was sent by Moses into Palestine, and they came back with this story that the cities are huge, and the crops are huge, and the people are huge. They're called Anakim, descendants of Anak. If you want to do a real interesting web search, search these two names side by side. You come into all kinds of really interesting stories about giants and proof of giants that have walked the face of the earth. As a matter of fact, some of those websites indicate that these so-called these giants that lived in ancient times, that they were really the ones who built these huge structures, that like the pyramids, like Machu Picchu and Stonehenge, that they propped up these great big stones in Stonehenge and so on, that they were actually these giant people that lived in ancient times. Real interesting kind of stuff. Now, the other thing I want to point out, it also touches with, when we studied Jude, there was a section, and this was a part of that section of Jude, that seems that he had borrowed from Jude, or that he had influence from the work First Enoch. First Enoch is an old time. It comes from the actually intertestamental time. Didn't make the Old Testament in Christian Protestant Bibles, but we know of the existence of this work. First Enoch comes from intertestamental times, and it had other stories about the Anakim and their connection with the ancient Hebrew peoples and so on. Also, let us keep in mind that this First Peter is evidently addressed to Christian communities that are heavily Gentile converts or converts from Greek society. And so in Greek mythology, of course, there's all kinds of myths about titans, giants that walk the face of the earth, right? And these titans, giants, cyclops, that they were produced by gods having intercourse with daughters of men. And in Greek mythology, they misbehaved, and so some of the other Greek gods confined them to, chained them to this place called Tartarus. It's really interesting that that phraseology is used here by the author of 2 Peter. Condemn them to the chains of Tartarus. In Greek mythology, Tartarus was the lowest place of the underworld. The lowest place of the underworld. Remember, they didn't think of it necessarily as hell. Okay? So, this reference is made. So what's the point? Even the mystic gods or angels or giants were subject to divine judgment because of their sinful misconduct. And the nature of their sinful misconduct, going back to the reference of Genesis, was having intercourse with the daughters of men. So there was definitely a sexual connotation to the misconduct. The second example, then, in verse 5, and if he did not spare the ancient world, even though he preserved Noah, the herald of righteousness, together with 7 others, when he brought the flood upon the godless world. So, using Noah as an example, and 7 others. You remember who the 7 others were saved besides Noah? Okay, his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. You know, and I just wonder, you know, after all that time on the ark, no wonder there was a new population explosion when they got off. I mean, besides all the animals, 2 by 2, huh? Okay. But, you know, in that story, if you go back to Genesis about Noah and the flood story, you know, it was the depravity of human beings at that time, and basically God was going to, you know, wipe everything out. It's not clear whether or not he wiped out the Nephilim with that flood, because the Anakim shows up later on. So that part of the, but the point of the flood story, Noah and the flood, is the God who creates all things can destroy all things, but the merciful God can also save and preserve those who are righteous. So the God who creates all things can also destroy all things, but the merciful God can also save those who are righteous. And the biblical story from the book of Genesis, Noah and his family, is the proof of that. Okay, now we have a comment here. Thomas, way in the back.
Okay, it's Luke 13:4. And Jesus is talking. For those 18 on whom the tower of Siloam fell and killed them, do you think that they were worse sinners than all other men who dwelt in Jerusalem? I tell you no. But unless you repent, you will likewise perish. Isaiah 245:6.
Now wait. We can't do multiple. So you cited Luke 18, you cited, and it was Jesus taking something from his contemporary history of a falling tower in Jerusalem and equating that evidently with the people who said they were great sinners. That's why the tower fell on them. No, we can just stop one thing at a time now, Thomas. Okay, trying to figure out how that fits in with the God who creates all things, can destroy all things, and also save all things. Okay, ancient people saw the destruction, overall destruction of a lot of people. Ancient Hebrews particularly said, well, they must have been sinning in some way. Even in Jesus' day, they must have been great sinners in some way. So, let's move on to this third example, which is a pretty obvious one, in verse 6. And he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction, reducing them to ashes, making them an example for the godless people of what is coming. Making them an example to godless people of what is coming. And if he rescued Lot, a righteous man, oppressed by the licentious conduct of unprincipled people, for day after day that righteous man lived among them, and was tormented in his righteous soul at the lawless deeds that he saw and heard, then the Lord knows how to rescue the devout. And so, he uses, as does Jude, the example of Sodom and Gomorrah. The difference is, he focuses on Lot. And calling Lot the righteous man, 2-3 times? Because Lot was saved from that destruction. Now, if you go back to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in the book of Genesis, Lot doesn't come off as being a very righteous man. He took in the visitors who were represented as angels who had just visited his nephew Abraham up on the hill. And he kind of protected them from the townspeople of Sodom and Gomorrah who wanted to do depraved deeds with these strangers. You can look it up in the book of Genesis yourself. Okay, about Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm not going to go into that, but there is a heavy, indication that what they wanted to do was depraved and sexual in nature. But 2 Peter, basically, he kind of sanitizes Mr. Lot's reputation here, 2 or 3 times calling him a righteous man. Why? Well, it fits in what he's trying to do using these stories. He's trying to make a point. Then, verse 9, then the Lord, or some translations might have for the Lord, but here it's, then the Lord knows how to rescue the devout from trial and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. Eventually, the Lord will act in judgment upon the unrighteous. What is interesting also, well, I don't know if it's interesting to you, but some find this interesting. The author of Jude uses these examples without, really too much indication of where they come from. The author of Peter uses these examples from Genesis chapter 6 from Genesis chapter 8 and 9, from Genesis chapter 19. What do you see? He follows the chronological order as they have been presented in Hebrew scriptures. Jude does not. But the author of 1 Peter does. Why? Because he's using these examples as what is called as types, as biblical models. Okay? And he's following them in the order that they would have appeared on the Genesis scroll as it would have been read in Jewish synagogue. So that his audience would, if they had a Jewish background, could find it easily or could identify with it easily if they had that Jewish background. Again, to make his point, these then are being used as typological prophecies. Remember, look at the outline. He's giving prophetic proof from the scriptures of what's going to happen to the unrighteous. These are all stories of those who are unrighteous and those who are righteous. Right? And it's God who saves, preserves, protects those who are righteous over against the unrighteous. Even while the righteous are living in an environment at the same time with the unrighteous. Certainly that can be found with the example of Mr. Noah and Mr. Lot, as they, as models or types, are being used by the author of 2 Peter. The day of judgment for those who are unrighteous, their day will come. And it's God who will judge them. Okay? So, what do you think about that?
Sounds like.
Oh, we got more coming up. Mr. Tom again?
Okay. This is what happened. The typhoon and the tsunami. It's Isaiah 45:6.
Isaiah 45:6.
There's no other. I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things. Amos 3:6. If a trumpet is blown in a city, will not the people be afraid, or do not the people tremble? When disaster comes to a city, or if there is a calamity in a city, will not the Lord have done it? Has not the Lord caused it? Amen. Is that
So-
Amos talking? And who's the other? Isaiah.
Isaiah 45 and Amos.
Isaiah 45:6 and Amos 3:6.
Those are other examples of prophecies of destruction that will happen, not in the day of the Lord or the day of judgment, but prophecies from before the time of Christ of things that had happened, and those prophets indicating that they will happen because of the injustice of some of the people at the time. That those examples, however, by what the examples you cite may or may not be another aspect of typology. That is, models or examples where prophetic utterances were made about destruction coming upon those who are not righteous, unrighteous. So, but it doesn't really fit in with this because we're looking at New Testament and not Old Testament. Now,
It says every day approximately 150,000 people throughout the world die
now Thomas, you're going off, getting into an area that is non-biblical.
Okay, I rest my case.
Okay.
I have a question. Was reference to Taurus, so that means that the Greeks have a great deal of influence in the territory at this time, or does this mean that this is being written in an area where the Greeks are prominent?
Okay, the question has come up, the mention of this Tartarus, which was the underworld in Greek mythology. Does that mean that this is written to a group of people where Greek culture is very much influenced? Yes, it does.
But is it pervasive through the whole region or the country?
Is it pervasive through the whole region and country? You know, we do not know exactly where this letter, what communities, what region those communities are addressed to. There's no geographic tag, so to speak, and from the beginning. But there is the assumption that that because it relies and uses, the author is using these examples from Greek mythology, as well as a heavy dose, as we see, examples from what we would call Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures, that the communities that he's writing and using these examples to are a combination. And where else do you have a combination of people with a Hebrew background and also a Greek-speaking or Greek-speaking background? You have that in early Christian communities. Okay? Very possibly in the western part of Asia Minor, what we call Turkey today, because that's where there's quite a few influenced by Greco-Roman. But the other thing you have to keep in mind is that the Greek mythologies throughout the Roman Empire at that time would have been fairly well known to those people who were given a classical education, right? Not everyone was, but they would have been familiar with the stories. The Greek stories would have been entertaining. You know, there's huge theaters and amphitheaters that are left over from the Greco-Roman times. How did the common people learn about the stories of the ancient gods and goddesses and so on? Public games, public amphitheaters, public performances. And those amphitheaters, many of them are still in existence yet today. Jim.
The term Tartar was even used to identify the invading Mongol hordes, since they were so merciless and terrible, they had to come from hell.
Okay, the ancient use of Tartar for Mongol hordes, but that came quite a few centuries later.
The term, you know, they still use the term.
Yeah, that they came from the underworld, or by the time the ancient Mongols came and began the downfall of the Roman Empire, the concept of hell was formulated a little more. And so, okay, that's now the next section. The next section, from verse 10, section B, through 14, he uses very strong language. I mean, this is where he really gets down in the author's condemnation of these false teachers. And I checked a number of different translations, and I'm going to use the old King James Version. Sorry, Clyde, I'm going to read it, see how this version compares with your King James Version, because I think that the wording here in the King James Version and in the New Jerusalem Bible version of this next section gets across some of the salient points of the condemnation of these false teachers in more descriptive ways. So, verse 10. from the King James Version. But chiefly them that walk after the flesh, in the lust of uncleanness, and despise government. Presumptuous are they, self-willed, and they are not afraid to speak evil of dignities. Whereas angels, which are greater in power and might, bring not railing accusation against them before the Lord. Verse 12, but these, as natural brute beasts, made to be taken and destroyed, speak evil of the things that they understand not, and they shall utterly perish in their own corruption. Verse 13, and shall receive the reward of unrighteousness, as they that count it pleasure to riot in the daytime. Spots they are, and blemishes, sporting themselves with their own deceivings, while they feast with you, having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls. At heart they are exercised with covetous practices. Accursed children are they. Now, some of the terms, even in this weak translation that we call English, and it makes no difference what English translation you use, the words in Greek are far more descriptive. But, words in this section, wrongdoing, even promiscuity, revelry, dissipation, debauchery, blots and blemishes, their eyes are full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They look upon women with lust. These words in English translating what? What seems to be outward behavior of these false teachers. It connects with that aspect of the examples that he had used earlier as prophetic proof texts of the unrighteous people who, because in many of those examples, were doing immoral sexual things. But it really seems that these false teachers, remember I said, they have taken upon themselves, they're evidently baptized Christians, but they feel day of judgment hasn't come, Christ isn't going to come, parousia hasn't happened, it's not going to happen, so we're free. We're free to do what we want. We're free. Now there's a couple of things embedded in here that we have to take a closer look at. When he says, verse 13, the end of verse 13, here in the King James Version, he says, spots they are, blemishes, sporting themselves with their own deceivings, while they feast with you. While they feast with you. In New American Bible, Catholic translation, thinking daytime revelry a delight, they are stains and defilements, as they revel in their seats while carousing with you. Verse 13, I want to see what's in other translations. Jerusalem, New Jerusalem translation, verse 13, read it.
Debauchery even by day, they make their pleasure. They are unsightly blots, and amuse themselves by their trickery, even when they are sharing your table.
Even while they're sharing your table, carousing with you, having a meal with you, what do you think he's referring to with that?
When they go to church, the Eucharist?
When they are gathered as a Christian community, when they are sharing what is, well, what Catholics would call Eucharist. In Jude, the term used in Jude is agape. Agape in Greek, the love feast, but love in the sense of Christian fellowship, Christian love. That was like the earliest term used for what became known as Mass, Eucharist, and so on. Now, in the same spot, just let me finish this and then we'll get to you. In this same spot then, however, in Peter, he uses a Greek term, apotheis. 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 Oh, it makes a difference. Otherwise, you think it's an appetite, okay, and you think it's actually a meal. But apotheis means deception or enticement, or as it's translated in some, dissipation or carousing. Huh?
Apostasy.
Well, apostasy, that's something else, okay? That would be more along the lines when we have the O instead of the A. Now, the terms are very close together, but it's an indication of the point he's trying to make, that the actions, when these false teachers are in community, in fellowship with other Christians in this community, their actions are deceptive, are enticing, are leading you towards behavior that's not consistent with what the good news is, not consistent with what the apostles taught, not consistent with what the disciples of the apostles taught we should be doing when we are gathered together in fellowship with one another. These false teachers are leading you astray, and therefore they are accursed children, or cursed of God. Okay? Comment over here.
And that makes sense what you're saying now, but what mine had, well, a feast would be, now I would not get, Eucharist out of that, I would get a meal out of that.
Okay, so comment. What translation of the Bible do you have? She says that the New International, while they feast with you. There's a description in the letters of Paul, for instance, of the fellowship meal or the agape meals. And Paul, I forget if it's the Corinthians that he scolds. You rich ones bring food and you feast while the poor ones get nothing. So evidently, when they gathered together, they had like a potluck, but they didn't share a whole lot of the pot. Okay? And it's not clear whether they then, after that meal, or before the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the cup. It's not clear, from if we want to question it from a liturgical standpoint. But there is that indication of a practice amongst early Christian communities that they brought food. Some cases they shared it, in some cases they did not share fairly. And so they did connect it with a love feast. And that would be more along the lines of this agape, love feast. But the ideal of the agape meal was that they did share with the poor. A point that St. Paul particularly makes, in his condemnation of those practices. The practices that are here, that he comes across so strongly, these false prophets are so engrossed in their immoral sensuality that they act out, and they're acting out even in daytime, right? He makes that point. Even in daytime, they're giving bad example. How does he say that? Oh, in verse 14, their eyes are full of adultery and insatiable for sin. They seduce unstable people, and their hearts are trained in greed. Now, they seduce untrained people. Evidently, they are causing others to do this as well. Weaker members, if you will, of the community as well. And they're training them. That's why they're false teachers. They're teaching, training. And the term in Greek that we have here, translated training, has athletic overtones. Okay? Like an athlete training. And so, evidently they are making disciples in order to make a profit. Which calls into question, okay, he's talking about depraved sexual practices and morality. They're training others to do so for a profit. What do we call that? Huh? Prostitution, huh? So you got to kind of wonder if nothing else. Of course, they have prostitution in that day and age too. Also, in many places, in some places, not many, in some places, in the high temples, especially to certain goddesses around the Roman era, the temple prostitutes. So there was like a religious overtone to practices in places like the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, the Temple of Diana, okay, as well in Corinth. So there were, under the guise of religious practices, carrying on religious prostitution. Accursed children, he says at the end, 14. Accursed are they. New Jerusalem Bible, I think, has it better. Right at the end of verse 14, how does it?
Accursed children.
Accursed lot.
Accursed lot?
On the end of 14,
Yeah.
with their eyes looking for adultery, people with insatiable capacity for sinning, they seduce the most unstable soul.
They seduce their eyes looking for adultery. That means when these people are coming to the Christian gathering for fellowship and prayer, they're looking at.
Checking out the crowd.
They're checking out the women in the crowd for their unholy practices. Huh?
The swine.
Swine? Yeah. Accursed are they, huh? Or cursed by God, or cursed of God are they. Yeah?
They could be also, since there's a Greek influence, they could be looking for other men too, because there was orgy practices of the Greeks included men having sex with men.
Well, and, the comment is made because they're Greeks, they could be also men looking for men. And the citing of Sodom and Gomorrah as an example here may be an indication of that, because the indication in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is that they are same-sex kind of thing.
That's what they thought the young men were.
Yeah.
Where
Dick?
Morty left off on verse 14, it says, where greed is concerned, they are at their peak of fitness. They are under a curse.
They are at, what translation of the Bible do
New
you?
Jerusalem.
New Jerusalem.
Or he didn't go to the end of 14.
Oh, so, so where greed is concerned, you're saying from the New Jerusalem Bible, where greed is concerned, they are at
The peak of fitness.
their peak of fitness. That there again, you have that allusion to athletic training and so on, and they are
Under a curse.
under a curse of God. Okay, Thomas in the back.
Here's the worst of the worst right here. It's Genesis 19:4.
Well, that's Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19.
This is beyond that. Okay, Genesis 19:4. All the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Lot said, "No, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man,"
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah, that
Oh, one more thing.
that's why
In Jude it says, "Snatch others from the fire." What does Jude mean by that? Verse 22, snatch them from the fire. I don't understand that.
you don't.
No.
Well, I'll tell you later. Jude 22. I'll tell you later. Because we had it last month when we were finishing Jude. Okay, now how are we doing here on? Couple minutes yet. Let's look at 15 and 16. Next, he uses another example from Hebrew heritage. Verse 15. Abandoning the straight road, they have gone astray, following the road of Balaam, the son of Bosor, who loved payment for wrongdoing, but he received a rebuke for his own crime. A mute beast spoke with a human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. Now, if you're not familiar with it, you can look up the story about Balaam, the prophet. It's in the book of Numbers, chapter 22. It's part of the Hebrew folk tradition. Balaam was not a Hebrew, but he confronts the Hebrews on their way with a prophecy, but he wanted to be paid for the prophecy. Now, even though 2 Peter uses the wrong name for his father, you might have a footnote in your Bible that suggests that. But the author of 2 Peter uses Balaam because, like Balaam, the false prophets have gone the same wrong way. There's a number of plays on words in Greek that put the point or the example kind of in tongue-in-cheek, okay? That doesn't come across real good in any English translation, all right? But maybe you can kind of get this. Abandoning the straight road, they have gone astray, following the road of Balaam. The road of Balaam he was trying to lead the Hebrew people, not giving them good directions, but he wanted to be paid for the direction he was leading them. And finally, it was his own donkey that talks to him and sets him straight, and it's like the voice of God. So from the voice of an ass, his prophecies are debunked, and he is set straight. And so using that example of Balaam and his talking donkey, okay, the author of this, Peter, is indicating these false prophets, they're nothing more than a talking. Oh, the time is up. Thank you very much. We'll see you in 2 weeks.